So I'm going to talk tonight about some saloon tokens from Santa Barbara. Not all the saloons from Santa Barbara, but a set of saloons, if you're familiar with Santa Barbara, clustered around State and Haley and what's Old Town. And I'm not as good. I just started reading a book that the ANS just published on French jetons. And the author in the introduction talks about there's historians and there's numismatists. Historians record history and interpret it, and numismatists catalog tokens and coins and that kind of stuff. And with his book, he was trying to hit something in between, talk about jetons within the culture, the French culture of the time. That would be a lofty goal for me. That's not exactly what I'm going to do, but I'm going to share a little bit of the history behind the tokens in our collections, and particularly these from Santa Barbara. I'm starting with Santa Barbara in 1839. I think my mouse will show up. The mission was up on a hill above what was to become the town of Santa Barbara. The location was chosen because of this mound right here, which is called Burton's Mound, but it was the location of a historic and prehistoric Chumash village, and the primary chief in this region of the Chumash area was from this village. There were 4 early presidios built in California. Presidios were forts that were built to protect the mission and surrounding missions at various locations along the coast of California: San Diego, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. And that gave these towns a historical point that's still important to them. The Presidio in Santa Barbara is right here. Today, the Presidio is partially reconstructed there. If we move ahead some to 1877, right down in this area was Burton's Mound. The mission is right back in this area, and the Presidio was right here, if you see my mouse arrow circling. And we're going to talk about these 2 blocks right in here. On this corner in 1877 was the Morris House. It had a different name when it was first built. There's another hotel over here, and this became the Oddfellows Hall. And then, of course, this is Stearns Wharf and the beach area of Santa Barbara today. I came about doing this study when I had a chance to expand my Santa Barbara and Santa Cruz token collection from the collection of Ron Lurch. So I had around 20 Santa Barbara tokens. Now I have around 70 Santa Barbara tokens. So it was a great opportunity for me. And what happened with the coronavirus is my travel to various shows went away, and all of a sudden I had a budget to actually buy those 2 parts of his collection in lieu of paying for plane tickets and hotel rooms. So it was fortunate. And right after I got the Santa Barbara tokens, I bought this postcard on eBay. State Street by Night in Santa Barbara, California. This is State Street, and this is Haley Street. That's crossing it right here. When I got it, I thought I recognized it and that it would relate to the tokens. The postmark on the back, October 6th, 5:30, the date was gone. So when was this postcard published? What does the scene represent? Well, there's some clues here. This is the Morris House. And from this photograph from 1885, you can see the Morris House. You can see that that's the same same building right there. Across the street is the French Laundry, and you can see the top of the building right here. That's the French Laundry. This building was the old Oddfellows building, but the real clue to this building is this sign right here, the beer glass. This is the Weiland's Beer Cafe. And the Weiland's Beer Cafe opened in 1903, and as we'll see later on, it closed in 1905. And in 1903, the front door opened onto Haley Street. So there's no front door right here. So that places us on the corner of State and Haley in 1903 in this peaceful, bucolic kind of picture. 1903 at the Morris House, O.S. Runyon bought the bar in the Morris House. So we know that this token not date before 1903 and doesn't date much later than that because he sold it a few years later, his interest in the bar. What's interesting is this token is signed L.H. Moise Company. That's something that's familiar to most of us who collect tokens in California. And this reverse is unlisted. The token itself is unlisted in Cap'n. I just so happen to have a T&A Gao Santa Barbara, California token, also good for 10 cents with that same reverse. And what's interesting about this token is that there are two versions of it. There is a version of it that's signed Klinkner, SF, which you can just see the remains of under the Moise. And the Klinkner version of this token is in album. And so this token was obviously restruck later after Moise acquired it, and he put his name over the old Klinkner token. So that kind of sets the mood. In 1903, bar changed hand in the Morris House. The Morris House was important. It was a stagecoach stop for Santa Barbara. So the stagecoaches came in, you would disembark there, and you had a hotel just up the street. Was another hotel known as Hotel Mascarell. And the bar in the Morris House was never a problem. But across the street, underneath the French Hotel, which was later purchased by the Morris House and became additional rooms for them, on the first floor was the Monarch Bowling Alley. And that's where we're first introduced to Marcus Bonetti and his partner, Pierce. And I'm just looking here, I don't have Pierce's first name on here. Marcus Bonetti was from Santa Maria, up the coast, still in Santa Barbara County. In 1889, he came down and purchased Weiland's Beer Mall, which is not the same as Weiland's Beer Cafe. It was further up the street and just off on De La Guerra Street in Santa Barbara. The Bonettis are a very large Santa Barbara family at the time. They were very well connected, wealthy ranchers. They had some money. And I wasn't able to find the linkage for certain, but in Guadalupe, which is next to Santa Maria, Alberto Bonetti had a saloon. And Cap'n attributed the A. Bonetti saloon token to Santa Barbara because there's Bonettis in Santa Barbara. That made sense. Guadalupe is not on the token, but the Alberto Bonetti's saloon was in fact in Guadalupe, not in Santa Barbara. After rebuilding the Weiland's Beer Mall, Bonetti partnered with Pierce to lease the bowling alley right across the street from the Morris House, below the Morris Annex in 1903. They removed 2 bowling alleys to create space, and they built their bar with billiard tables. And in 1903, they opened as the Monarch Bar and Billiard Hall at 526 State Street. They had 4 tokens altogether. that were issued. I have two in my collection. The first token was like what you see on the screen, except instead of saying Bonetti, it said Bunetti. So it was spelled with a U instead of an O. And I believe they rejected that token because it was misspelled. I've never seen one. I just know that Kappan cataloged it. And then they got this token back when it was remade. The U was replaced with the O, but it still had two N's in the name instead of one N. And I'm assuming they needed the tokens and didn't want to wait, so they kept them. This token's 25 millimeters, so it's larger than you would use in a slot machine. And so these things were probably actually used to buy drinks, whether they gave them out, whether they used them as change. For whatever reason, they used these tokens. And I also bought the Santa Cruz collection, as I mentioned. And in researching one of the saloons in the Santa Barbara one, in the Santa Cruz case, I found an article about a dead body being found next to the rail tracks in San Obispo. And on the dead body was a purse, a wallet, no ID in it, but the wallet was from, had the name of the saloon in Santa Cruz in it. And in the wallet, in addition to change, was a drink token from the saloon in Santa Cruz. So people did in fact use these. They carried them in their pockets. That's why you see them as aware. They're part of that saloon culture in California in the early 1900s. They also issued this token, Monarch Bar B&P for Bonetti and Pierce, and it's good for 5 cents in trade. They also had one the same size, good for 10 cents in trade. I don't have one, but this token is done by Worth and Jackins in San Francisco. And Worth and Jackins were only made tokens for a few years. And this token falls within that period that Worth and Jackins was a separate company with their own name. So you're starting to see in these, in the Morris House token and this token, that these were both manufactured in San Francisco. Now, LA Rubber Stamp was already in business, and you'll see a little bit later, there is an LA Rubber Stamp token in this set of Santa Barbara tokens, but clearly the manufacturers in San Francisco were active in Santa Barbara. Bonetti and Pierce, only a few years later, sold to Manuel Carriaga in April of 1907. Now, Carriaga has an interesting story. His family was from the Santa Maria area, actually in Los Alamos, and his father died in 1903, and he went on to manage his father's estate. His father's estate included the largest Union oil field that had been discovered in the state of California up to that time. If you have ever driven 101 through Santa Maria and you are exiting the south of Santa Maria, you might notice capped oil wells. When I first lived in Santa Barbara, they still had the oil pumper heads there in those fields. Now they're all capped. But that was part of his father's estate. It was worth $150,000 in 1903. He had one sister and one niece. He was looking to inherit a third of that $150,000, and more importantly, all the royalties coming in off the oil fields. Well, lo and behold, his uncle Ramon says, hold on a minute, I own half of that property. And sure enough, he had the paperwork. His uncle owned half of it. He owned half of the royalties. That greatly decreased his potential income. And so he frittered around and never closed the estate. Well, what he was doing was borrowing against the property and using the royalties from the oil without sharing them with his uncle, his sister, or his niece. So he was in financial trouble. And I assume looking for using that money to get out of it to make up for the money. It was almost 10 years later before he finally closed the estate. So he was in bad trouble. Well, he partnered with F.J. Philishot in 1906 in a livery and cab service known as Tally Ho Stables at 532 State Street. So it's immediately adjacent to the Monarch Bar. My guess is the two partners spent a lot of time in the bar and decided it was more profitable than the livery and stable service. And in addition, in 1905, 1906, this is at the height of the anti-bar movement, the temperance movement. And almost every year there would be a bill on the, a law on the ballot to close the saloons in Santa Barbara. Same thing in Santa Cruz. I'm sure it was happening throughout the state. It just became a lot of damn trouble, I think, for Bonetti and Pierce, and they had better things to do with their time. So they sold the bar to Manuel Carriega. Carriega also borrowed from his uncle Ramon to purchase the bar. Philishot is named as a financial partner, but his name was not on the saloon license. And you'll see that that becomes interesting and as the story continues. Well, this is their token for the LACEY bar. LACEY whiskey was the most popular whiskey that was distilled in San Francisco. So I'm assuming they did some kind of trade with LACEY whiskey to name the bar after it, 526 State Street. This particular token is struck, and if you see my mouse down here, by Patrick and Company in San Francisco. So that's now the third San Francisco token maker to show up on Santa Barbara token. And this is also 21 millimeters, so I'm sure it was used in a slot machine. Although what's interesting is the tokens in Santa Barbara, and I'm noticing in Santa Cruz, are good for 5 cents and 10 cents. So I don't know if they had different slot machines they played in, or what. I'm just not sure on that. In September 1908, so this is a year after Carriega bought the bar, 300 troopers from the 5th Cavalry camped in Santa Barbara. They were marching by foot from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and they would have a day's march and they would camp wherever they were. Well, in September, they appeared in Santa Barbara and camped around the area, which is Earl Warren Showgrounds, which is on 101 if you're familiar with Santa Barbara. And of course, as all good soldiers do when they've been marching all day long, they went out to drink that night, and they spread out around the various bars and saloons in town. And one group of them were drinking at the LACEY, and they began to disparage Mexicans. Well, Santa Barbara is a Spanish town from the Spanish moving into California and the Catholic Church, and Carriega was obviously a Spanish name. Well, the local patrons in the saloon, who are mostly of Spanish descent, took exception, and a fight broke out. It soon spilled out into the street and became a riot. 15 or so Santa Barbara police arrive to break it up, and Carriega comes out to object. to the police interfering with his customers. And when the police told him to stand down, he dared the police chief to arrest him, which the police chief did. So he was arrested, marched to the jail. The newspaper report said all the way regaling the police chief in language not fit to print in the local newspaper. So the city council, at the request of the police chief, decided to close down the LACEY. That brought Uncle Ramon to the city council, said, hold on a minute. I own the paper on the LACEY. I'm going to repossess it and sell it. And so I need the liquor license to facilitate the sale. So they left the liquor license in Uncle Ramon's hands. They closed the bar, but after a month of it for being the sale, people started complaining that late at night they would see men exiting the rear of the bar. So the police chief finally came in and put his own padlocks on all the doors to the bar to make sure that it remained closed. And I'm just going to take a romantic an aside. I wrote an article on this for TAMS, which should come out sometime in the next year. This is not in that article, but doing the research on the bar, I discovered that the Enterprise Saloon, which was across the street from the LACEY next to the Morris House, was open from the late 1800s to about 1903, and it sold, and it became the Magnolia Saloon, and then it sold again. But by 1908, it was owned by a man named Bruno U. Orella. Orella and the Carriagas were big-time families in Santa Barbara County. And in 1907, Ramon Carriaga's son and Orella's daughter married. The newspaper reports declaring it to be uniting of two of the oldest Spanish families in the Santa Barbara region. And it's not really part of this story about problems on State Street, but here are the two tokens. The Enterprise Saloon at 529, which was sold in 1903 and started to go through the names. And again, this token was made by Patrick and Company in San Francisco. So the San Francisco token makers are in Santa Barbara pretty early. Orella's token is the only one, I think, in this set of tokens that was struck by LA Rubber Stamp. Now, LA Rubber Stamp opened in the 1890s. So why it took them so long to get into the Santa Barbara market, I'm not sure. And there may be some earlier tokens that I've not noted yet, but it's interesting to see how far the reach of San Francisco was. But back to the LACEY. The LACEY was declared the most disorderly saloon in Santa Barbara. It was said that when young women or women and their mothers walked down State Street, as they approached the 500 block, they moved to the other side of the street and passed by the Morris House so they wouldn't be accosted by the drunks hanging outside the LACEY bar. Well, Harry S. Dix finally agreed to purchase the LACEY bar in January 1909, and in getting the liquor license, he promised to clean it up. But interestingly, Phyllis Shaw continued as the LACEY bartender. Now, Harry S. Dix worked for another stable and transom company in Santa Barbara, so he may have known them from the stable business in the Tally-Ho stables. But after promising to clean it up, the story of the LACEY goes from bad to worse. Bar fights continued, civil disturbances continued, the police were always there, they were complaining to the city council, but it was gambling that brought the bar down, not drinking. In a trial that ensued after the LACEY was accused of supporting gambling. And by this time, most bars and saloons had a back room which was used for playing cards. And they were made illegal around 1905, 1906. Slot machines were not illegal because slot machines paid out tokens that were good for merchandise, not money. Well, a cigar dealer and poker player that was at the game, when he testified before the city councils, he said, "I have lived in Nevada, and I guess I wouldn't call what I saw at the LACEY disorderly." Makes you wonder what life was like in Nevada compared to Santa Barbara. After the testimony for a couple of days, Philoshow beat up a witness who testified to the gambling, and the city council revoked the liquor license and closed the bar. I thought I'd changed that typo there. And closed the bar in August 1910. So it was maybe touch and go for Dick's, but Philoshow ensured the bar would be closed. And they have one token. Again, this is an LA rubber stamp token. LACEY Whiskey, the LACEY Bar, HS Dick's, Santa Barbara, and Weiland's Beer. Good for one drink. So the LACEY Bar was a very notorious place in 526 State Street. Just up the street from there, on the other side of the stables, was the Olympia restaurant. I'm sorry, I will get to there was the Imperial Bar. Angelo Mirrati had opened a restaurant, the Olympia restaurant, a block off of State Street, and a boarding house. And as soon as he had an opportunity, he got the building next to the Imperial Bar and moved his restaurant to there, and they remodeled the place and moved their boarding house above the bar. In 1904, their business partners, the two brothers, Angelo and Louis, took on the partner Charles Vissolini and purchased the Imperial Bar that was next door. They received their liquor license in 1904 after being required to nail shut the internal door between the two establishments. So there were different prices for liquor licenses. Hotels could have a liquor license because you couldn't have a hotel without a bar. Restaurants could get a cheaper liquor license, and they had the right with that liquor license to sell drinks with food. If you did not serve food, you could not sell a drink. And so that's why they had to close the door, because it kind of, you could go into one and walk next door and buy a drink and come back and not have to buy any food. It just made it somewhat difficult to enforce. And then a saloon license was the most expensive license in the hierarchy of liquor licenses. And in Santa Barbara at this time, saloons contributed $25,000 a year in license fees to the city, which was about half of the city's budget. So now comes the next set of tokens. The Imperial Bar, Santa Barbara. I believe that this token predates the Mirrati's ownership. And this is an LA rubber stamp token as well. And I believe that because I think these larger tokens, this is 28 millimeters, was a style from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And then the style changed as slot machines became more ubiquitous. And so the Imperial Mirrati and Company, which is definitely their tokens, since they're signed, both 21 millimeters, good for 5 cents and good for 10 cents at the bar. These are not signed, but this 10 cent, the style of that appears to me to be an LA rubber stamp. And so it may be once you had a relationship with a token manufacturer, you're more likely to stay with them. But it does raise a question in my mind of, since they're all good in a slot machine, what's the difference between a 5 and 10 cent, unless the 10 cent is a higher payout? There was an Olympia saloon in Santa Barbara. It was still around at this time. It's further up State Street. There was never a problem with the Olympia bar, but the restaurant is the Olympia restaurant. And I believe this token is from the restaurant and not the saloon. There was also an Olympia barber, but I don't believe that this is from a barber. And 25 cents in trade, that was the value of a dinner. So if you wanted to give out something to bring somebody in, this token would be good for a dinner. So that would kind of end the story, except there are two tokens called Remember the San Diego. And the first one that I bought rather cheap because it was attributed to San Diego. It's not San Diego. John A. Rathel moved from Deming, New Mexico to Santa Barbara in 1898, and he became a wholesale distributor for the San Diego Brewery. As his business expanded, he ran out of space and he ran out of the space he leased in the old Oddfellows building, located across the street from the Wyland Cafe. He bought a lot across the street, formed a partnership with James McAvoy in 1902, and they began construction on their new business in 1903. And if we go back, here's Wyland's Cafe. This is the Oddfellows Hall. This is the San Diego that the partners built in 1903. Remember the San Diego for a cool drink, John A. Rathel. Good for 1 5-cent drink or cigar. 28 millimeter, common for the time. These are not slot machine tokens. And I just pushed the wrong button. Well, they were only open a little more than a year before trouble started at the San Diego. On December 1st, 1904, Rathel filed suit to annul the partnership with McAvoy. The newspaper articles are interesting about this lawsuit because the newspaper articles say everybody knew there was bad blood between these two partners. Everybody on the street knew it. Well, the partnership, so we see some insight into saloons at this point in time, because it's all in the newspaper articles about their partnership. So McAvoy invested $2,500 for undivided half interest in the business. Their partnership agreement said each would receive $500 a month, and remaining profits would be split at the end of the year. Neither partner could order stock or expend funds without the consent of the other. Rathel said McAvoy acted on his own, expended funds, and refused to pay any money to Rathel. McAvoy's response, his attorney's response, is also in the papers. They denied all charges. They countercharged that Rathel left in July 1904 to attend the St. Louis World's Fair and ignored the business on his return. 20 million people went to the St. Louis World's Fair, so it was not unusual that people from all around the country went to the St. Louis World's Fair. Those of you that remember anything I said about Charbonneau dollars, when Charbonneau got married in Seattle in 1904, his father-in-law sent he and his new wife to the St. Louis World's Fair. So everybody went to the St. Louis World's Fair. So McAvoy says when he came back, he ignored the business. And in fact, he was working with a Mr. Wonder, conspiring to depreciate the value of the bar to forced McAvoy to sell at a loss. I haven't found anything about a Mr. Wonder, and as you'll see later, when Raythel moved to a new business, there was no Mr. Wonder. So this was something that McAvoy came up with. McAvoy also demanded payment for $1,000 as a remedy for the lawsuit. On January 25th, 1905, McAvoy settled the lawsuit, buying Raythel's share of the business for $5,000. So you can see he's now got $7,500 invested in it. And the first thing he did is struck his own token. Remember the San Diego for a cool drink, J.M. McAvoy, good for one drink at the bar. This is a half a millimeter larger than Raythel's drink token. And I think that jealousy between Raythel having a token for the bar was part of the bad blood between the two partners, because Raythel was very popular in Santa Barbara. McAvoy wasn't. So what did Raythel do? Well, if you remember that picture of the big beer glass, Wyland Cafe, Raythel bought Wyland Cafe from A.M. Carrillo in 1905. Carrillo had his own problems in that he was serving beer without food. And so he lost, his business was closed. Rather than lose his license, he sold it to Raythel. He was also a bartender at several other saloons, and every place he tended bar generally had a problem with the cops, serving after hours, what have you. Well, Raythel remodeled the building and moved the entrance to the State Street side. That's part of how I know that the postcard had to date before 1905. And there was an external cigar sales stand that was moved from the outside to inside the bar. But the bad blood wasn't settled between McAvoy and Raythel. There was only one building that separated their two bars now. And in 1907, a complaint was filed that Raythel was selling alcohol after hours. Well, when he was actually arrested, it turned out it was McAvoy's wife who filed the complaint. And when it went to court, a group of old men from the GAR showed up to testify on Raythel's behalf. And on the night in question, one of their members, they were in town for a GAR meeting, got sick. And Raythel allowed them to sit with the old gentleman until he felt better and good enough to walk to their hotel. And then they left and swore that they had nothing to drink. This is the Grand Army of the Republic, old veterans. The jury identified with them, and Raythel was acquitted. Not long after that, on Christmas Day, Raythel's place burned to the ground. There were it was a rooming house on the second floor. And in 1910, a man by the name of John Murphy returned to Santa Barbara and said he couldn't take it anymore. He felt guilty. He confessed that he set the fire above Raythel's place at the behest of McAvoy. At the time, John Murphy was a bartender for McAvoy, had a room above Raythel's place, and he said McAvoy paid him to start the fire and then leave town. He came back, said he was feeling guilty. McAvoy was arrested. Murphy was arrested. McAvoy said he's just mad because he wanted to borrow $10 from me in 1907 and I refused to lend it to him. So he came back and claimed that I paid him to start the fire. And so it ended up that they had no way of telling who was telling the truth and who was lying. So the case was dropped and both released, and that was the end of that story. But this is Raythel's place, good for one drink or cigar. This is a Patrick piece from San Francisco once again. And I've always wondered about this piece because you rarely I've never seen one that's worn. I've seen one that's been misstored and mistreated, but they're almost all uncirculated or AU like this. And I believe that these were probably ordered and arrived just before the bar burned. And that's why you don't see worn pieces out there, because they never really went into circulation. When Wrathall rebuilt the bar, he called it John's Place. And therein lies the end of that story. Again, not in my story about the problems on State Street, but just before Prohibition, 510 State Street became the Frank Lostalat bar. This is good for 25 cents in trade. He was one of the bar owners, saloon owners in Santa Barbara that always had a good reputation. His saloon was elsewhere, and just before Prohibition, he moved to the corner of State and Haley. I'm going to end this story with a short little piece of what got me interested in writing this. Last fall, my wife and I were in Santa Barbara to go to a memorial service for a good friend. We got in on late Friday afternoon, decided to go out to dinner. We ended up at 526 State Street, the old location of the LACEY bar. The buildings changed after the 1925 earthquakes. Things were torn down. They are newer buildings, but still built right after the earthquake. We didn't have reservations, so we ended up at the steakhouse at 526 State Street at a table out on the sidewalk, watching the Friday night crowds of millennials and Gen Zers walking around. In that early picture, you may have noticed the trolley line. Santa Barbara today has a trolley that's built on a truck chassis, so it looks like it's a trolley on sticks. In the evenings, on the weekends, the trolley does bar hopping up and down Santa Barbara. So everybody on the trolley is drinking and having a good time. You can imagine yourself back in 1905, 1906, Santa Barbara. The only thing that's different is you see women walking together and drinking. You see them going into the bars and drinking, and that did not happen back in 1903 to 1910. It was illegal for women to be in bars. That was after they would catch young girls in bars with old men, and so they just made bars off limits. Today, so I said the Morris House was at one end of the 500 block. At the other end of the block was the Masserelle Hotel. That was destroyed in the earthquake, and after the earthquake in 1926, Hotel Santa Barbara was built at that same location. And Hotel Santa Barbara today, if you stay there, when you check out, you get this Gold Club coin. And if you bring that back the next time you stay there, you get $10 off each night that you stay by surrendering your coin. When you check out, you get another coin. It comes in this nice little bag. And so there's still a token tradition going on. And right across the street is Joe's Cafe. Now, Joe's Cafe was not originally at this location. It was in the 400 block right next to that old Oddfellows Hall. But it was a cafe that was probably a speakeasy during Prohibition. It started before Prohibition. It lasted through Prohibition. And when Joe's Cafe moved up the street to this new location, everybody, the patrons and everybody chipped in to help carry that old bar and mirror backdrop and all that stuff up a block to go into their new location. So there is still a little tradition of the old saloon life in Santa Barbara in the 400 and 500 block of the city. And that's the end of my talk for the evening. I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Bill.
Bill, I'm just absolutely amazed at the detail of your research on these things.
I started to do this research years ago when I lived in Santa Barbara and started collecting tokens. And I'd go sit in the library and go through old directories and see if I could find these businesses. That doesn't give you any information about a business except the year that it existed. Thanks to newspapers.com, which I subscribe to, and the California Digital Newspaper Archive at the University of California, Riverside, you can go back and do keyword searches. You can read through the newspapers, and that's where the stories come from. And so one thing I did not mention for token collectors in that lawsuit between over dicks and gambling, two of the people who testified, one owned the pool hall next to the LACEY bar, and he said it was really loud and noisy, and he had to extend the partition between his pool hall and the LACEY bar all the way to the ceiling because it was bothersome. Well, he was one of the guys gambling in the back room when the LACEY bar was busted. The cigar dealer who said that it was a lot worse in Nevada than anything he saw in Santa Barbara was also a habitual gambler and in that card game. And a year later, the two men got into an argument, and the cigar dealer used a lead pipe and hit the other pool hall owner up the side of the head. He didn't charge. He didn't bring charges against the guy because they gambled together frequently. But what I gathered from reading between the lines in the article is the pool hall guy also had a slot machine and sold cigars, as almost every pool hall did. And instead of being in his own pool hall, he had gone up to Wood's Pool Hall, which I have not been able yet to connect that name with the name of the cigar store that he had. But McDonald had gone up there, and by the end of the afternoon, had won more than a pocket full of good for cigar tokens from the slot machine in the other cigar dealer's store. And that kind of pissed off the cigar store owner, that his competitor was there winning good for one cigar tokens and had a pocket full of them by the time he interceded and wanted to kick him out of his business. And when he refused to leave, gave him a little extra incentive to go. So there's great stories around these tokens as you, when you have the resources to dig deeper.
Yeah, but I'm amazed at, like on that postcard, how you knew that the door was on only one side of the building. So it determined the year that the building was, that postcard was determined. How do you figure that out?
So in 1905, when Rathel began his remodeling, the descriptions in the newspaper of what he was doing to remodel the cafe. And, and in the postcard, you can see there is no door on the State Street side.
That's a small detail.
It's a small detail, but I recognized the beer glass, so I knew there was a Weiland's Beer Cafe. And then as doing the other research, it opened in 1903, and in 1905 he sold it. So that postcard image has to date between the opening of the Wineland Cafe and Raythel buying it in 1905.
Great story, Bill. I really enjoyed it.
So that became and that inspired me to go ahead and say, okay, which of these saloon tokens are from here? It's such a great scene. You know, I just had dinner there. You know, it's a lively place. And so in going through and researching the bars, that's first thing I came up with was the LACEY bar was the most disorderly, notorious saloon in Santa Barbara. There were a couple others lower down State Street from there, but that's another story. And I had to keep this one to a manageable length. So I just built it around that corner.
Yeah, most notorious is always a good starting point.